The father's justice. My daughter-in-law looked at a room full of people, smiled, and said, "Don't talk to him. He's just our butler." And what hurt more than that sentence was my own son leaning in close, lowering his voice, and whispering, "Dad, please don't embarrass us." If you've ever been in a room where everyone suddenly goes quiet, where you feel every pair of eyes on you, and realize the people who should stand beside you are the ones stepping away, then you already understand what that moment feels like. My name is Frank Miller. I'm 66 years old, and I spent most of my life believing that if you showed up for your family, if you gave more than you took, things would somehow balance out. That morning was Thanksgiving, the kind of day that's supposed to feel warm, familiar, safe. The house was already alive before sunrise. By noon, 35 guests had filled every corner of what they all believed was my son Jason's home. Laughter drifted between rooms. Glasses clinked softly under the afternoon light. The long dining table stretched wall to wall, covered in polished silverware and carefully arranged centerpieces that Ashley had spent days planning. I had been awake since 5, standing in the kitchen with sleeves rolled up, moving between the stove and the counter. The smell of roasted turkey, mixed with butter and herbs, hung thick in the air. A tray of appetizers rested in my hands as I stepped into the living room, weaving between conversations that paused just long enough to glance at me, then continued. It wasn't the first time I had moved through a room like that. Quiet, unnoticed, expected. But that afternoon felt different. The way people looked at me, the way Ashley positioned herself between her guests and me, the way Jason avoided meeting my eyes, it all carried something I couldn't quite name yet. And standing there, holding that tray, listening to the low hum of voices around me, I started to realize this wasn't just about one careless sentence. It was something much deeper, something that had been building for a long, and I had somehow missed it. I was just stepping into the living room with a tray balanced carefully in both hands when one of Ashley's guests, a woman I'd seen once or twice before, turned toward me with a polite smile. "How long have you been working for the family?" she asked, her tone light, almost curious. For a second, I thought I had misheard her. I opened my mouth to answer, but before a single word came out, Ashley's voice cut in, smooth and sharp at the same time. "Oh, don't bother talking to him," she said, reaching for a glass from the tray without even looking at me. "He's just our butler. Help is supposed to be invisible, not chatty." The words landed in the middle of the room like something heavy, something that didn't belong there but suddenly filled all the space anyway. Conversation slowed, then stopped. Someone near the fireplace cleared their throat. A fork touched a plate and stayed there. I could feel it. 35 people shifting, glancing, pretending not to stare while still watching. The woman who had spoken to me blinked, her smile fading into something uncertain. "Oh, I didn't realize," she murmured, stepping back slightly. Ashley gave a small laugh, the kind that sounds effortless if you don't listen too closely. "No harm done," she said. "Frank, why don't you check the kitchen? I'm sure something needs your attention." She said my name like it was part of a routine, like this had all been practiced. I stood there a second longer than I should have. The tray felt heavier now, though nothing had changed on it. The light coming through the windows caught the edge of the glassware, scattering reflections across the wall, bright, sharp, almost distracting. I kept my hands steady, placed the tray down on the nearest side table, and straightened slightly, more out of habit than intention. Across the room, I finally found Jason. He had been standing near the dining table, half turned toward a group of guests, but now he was looking at me. Our eyes met for just a moment. There was something there. Not surprise, not anger, something closer to discomfort. He walked over quickly, his steps controlled, measured, like he was trying not to draw attention. "Dad," he said under his breath, leaning close enough that no one else could hear. "Please, don't make a scene. Just go along with it, okay?" I looked at him, really looked this time. The lines around his eyes, the way his jaw tightened as he spoke, the careful distance he kept between us even as he stood inches away. He wasn't defending me. He wasn't correcting her. He was managing me, like I was the problem that needed to be contained. The room stayed quiet a second too long. People had gone back to talking, but the rhythm wasn't the same. Voices were softer, slower, as if everyone was waiting for something else to happen. I could still feel it pressing in from all sides, that moment that hadn't quite passed yet, that space where something had been said that couldn't be unsaid. And standing there, with my son asking me to disappear in my own home, I realized this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. It was just the first time no one bothered to hide it. For a few seconds, I didn't move. Jason's hand was still lightly on my arm, like he was trying to guide me out of the moment without anyone noticing. I could feel the heat rising in my neck, the quiet weight of the room pressing in, the way people pretended to look away but didn't quite succeed. And then, something shifted. Not outside, but inside me. A small sound escaped before I could stop it. Just a breath at first, then a low chuckle that didn't belong in that silence. Jason's grip tightened slightly. "Dad," he whispered again, sharper this time, but the sound had already grown. It rose out of me, steady, unexpected, until it filled the space between the conversations that hadn't quite recovered yet. Heads turned. A couple near the window paused mid-sentence. Someone set down a glass a little too quickly. Ashley's smile flickered. Not gone. Just thinner. "Is something funny?" she asked, her tone still controlled, but not as smooth as before. I shook my head lightly, reaching up to press my fingers against my temple as if I was trying to settle something there. "No, no," I said, though the quiet laugh still lingered in my voice. I didn't realize how strange this all must look." Jason shifted beside me, his shoulders tense. "Dad, please," he said again, barely moving his lips, but I wasn't looking at him anymore. I glanced around the room, really seeing it this time. The polished table, the plates already set, the coats draped neatly over chairs in the corner, the soft yellow light from the overhead fixtures catching on glass and silver. It all looked exactly the way it was supposed to. That was the strange part. "You know," I said, a little louder now, not enough to command the room, but enough that the nearby conversations slowed again. "It's interesting how a place can feel one way and be something else entirely." I let the words settle, not rushing to explain them. A few people exchanged glances. Someone gave a polite half-smile, unsure whether to react or ignore it. Ashley crossed her arms, just slightly, her posture still composed, but more alert. "Frank," she said, "if there's something you want to say?" "I think there's just been a misunderstanding," I replied, cutting in gently, not raising my voice. I kept my tone even, almost casual, but my eyes moved from one face to another, taking in the quiet attention that had returned. Not a big one, just enough that things don't quite add up the way they should. The room held still again, not completely silent, but close enough that every small movement felt louder than it was. Jason exhaled slowly beside me, like he was bracing for something he couldn't quite predict. And standing there, with all those eyes shifting back toward me, I realized I wasn't laughing because it was funny. I was laughing because, for the first time, I could see the whole picture, and I wasn't sure how no one else had noticed it yet. I let the silence stretch just a little longer, long enough for the room to settle into that uneasy stillness, where people don't quite know whether to keep talking or stop completely. Then I reached for the edge of the side table, resting my hand there as if I needed something steady, something real. "You see," I said, my voice even, not raised but clear enough to carry across the space, "there's one detail that seems to be missing from the story everyone's been told." Ashley's eyes fixed on me, sharper now. Jason shifted beside her, his posture tightening, like he was already anticipating where this might go. "I think," I continued, glancing briefly at the dining table. The plates arranged in perfect symmetry, the wine glasses catching the soft overhead light. It's easy to assume things when you only see part of the picture. I paused, letting my gaze move slowly across the room, from one guest to another. Some avoided eye contact. Others didn't. "What part?" Ashley asked, her voice controlled, but there was something underneath it now, something less certain. I nodded once, almost to myself. The part about who's been paying for all of this. No one spoke. Not immediately. It wasn't dramatic. Not loud. Just a small shift. Like the air had changed pressure without anyone noticing exactly when. The house, I added, turning slightly, gesturing toward the walls without making a show of it. The cars out front, the credit cards, the groceries that have been coming in week after week, even this dinner. My hand moved lightly toward the table, the food laid out in careful rows. All of it. Jason let out a quiet breath, like he had forgotten to do it. "Dad," he started, but the word didn't go any further. Ashley's expression didn't collapse, not all at once. It held for a second, still composed, still balanced, and then something flickered behind it. "I think you're mistaken," she said, a little too quickly. "Jason handles our finances." I looked at her, not arguing, not correcting, just holding the space between us for a moment. "Does he?" I asked, not with challenge, but with a kind of quiet curiosity. A couple of guests shifted in their seats. Someone near the back reached for their drink and then set it down again without taking a sip. The room wasn't silent, but it wasn't comfortable anymore either. "I'm not saying anything complicated," I went on, keeping my tone steady, almost conversational. "Just that the version of things you've all been seeing, it's not the full one." I glanced at Jason again, just briefly this time. His eyes were fixed somewhere near the floor, like he was trying to piece something together that didn't quite fit. The light from the window had shifted slightly, softer now as the afternoon moved on, casting longer shadows across the floor. It made everything look just a little different, familiar, but not quite the same as it had been an hour ago. "I suppose," I said after a moment, letting the words come slowly, "it depends on how much you actually want to know." And that was the part no one answered right away. Because once you start asking that kind of question, there's no simple way to stop halfway. 3 years earlier, the house I was living in didn't sound like this one. It was quieter, almost too quiet. After my wife passed, the rooms held on to silence in a way I wasn't used to. Her chair by the window stayed where it had always been, a folded blanket still resting over the arm. A book left face down on the side table as if she might come back and finish the page. 42 years is a long time to build a life with someone, and an even longer time to learn how to exist without them. Her name was Margaret. She had a way of keeping things steady, not loud, not forceful, just present. She was the one who smoothed over the distance between Jason and me when it started to grow. After she was gone, that space didn't just stay, it widened. Calls became shorter. Visits became less frequent. Conversations felt like they were missing something we both didn't know how to replace. Around that same time, I started noticing things about Jason that he didn't say out loud. The way he hesitated before answering simple questions, the late-night messages that stopped just short of asking for help, the pauses when money came up in conversation. Ashley would speak quickly, confidently, but there was always a tightness behind it, like everything depended on things staying exactly as they appeared. I didn't need them to explain it to me. I'd been through enough years, enough risks, enough setbacks of my own to recognize what strain looks like when someone is trying to hide it. The bills, the pressure, the way pride keeps you from admitting you're falling behind, it all shows, just not in obvious ways. Margaret and I had never lived beyond what we needed. We kept things simple, even when we didn't have to. Her family had done well long before I met her, and over time, between her inheritance, my business, and a few decisions that worked out better than I expected, we ended up with more than we ever talked about. It wasn't something we built our identity around, it was just there. When she passed, everything came to me. The accounts, the investments, the property we had quietly held onto for years. I remember sitting at the kitchen table one evening, papers spread out in front of me, the light overhead casting a soft circle across the surface. It wasn't overwhelming, just final. Clear in a way that didn't leave much room for hesitation. I could have written Jason a check, solved everything in one moment. But I knew him well enough to understand what that would do. He wouldn't have seen it as help. He would have seen it as something taken from him. So I chose a different way. I found the house first. 8 bedrooms, more space than any of us really needed. but enough room that it could feel like a fresh start. I paid for it outright, quietly, without drawing attention to the numbers. When I handed Jason the keys, I kept my explanation simple. I told him it was time to move forward, that this was his chance to build something stable. What I didn't explain was everything behind it. The payments that would never show up as his responsibility, the accounts I kept separate, the way I arranged things so he could believe, honestly, that he had found his footing on his own. It wasn't about control. It wasn't about leverage. It was about giving him space to stand without feeling like he was leaning on me. At least, that's what I believed at the time. Because when you decide to help someone without telling them, you're not just choosing what to give, you're also choosing what they'll never fully understand, and I hadn't yet considered what that might turn into. It didn't happen all at once. There wasn't a single moment where everything changed. No clear line I could point to and say, that's when it started. It came in small adjustments, quiet suggestions that sounded reasonable if you didn't look too closely. Ashley was the one who introduced most of them. She had a way of saying things that made them feel practical, efficient, almost helpful. At first, it was simple. "Frank, since you're home more, would you mind starting dinner a little earlier?" she asked one evening, standing by the kitchen counter with her phone in hand. The request didn't feel strange. I nodded, turned back to the stove, and let the routine settle in. The next week, it became breakfast too, then laundry, then cleaning. Each addition came with the same tone, light, almost casual, as it had always been part of the plan. Jason didn't question it. He would come home, loosen his tie, sit at the table, and thank me in passing, not in a way that lingered, just enough to acknowledge the meal in front of him. Conversations stayed short. Ashley handled the rest, organizing things, setting expectations, and making sure everything ran the way she preferred. A month later, she brought home a set of clothes, black pants, white shirts, neatly folded and placed on the edge of my bed. "It just looks more professional when we have guests," she said, adjusting the sleeves slightly as if she were fixing something already decided. "It helps avoid confusion." I remember holding the fabric for a moment, feeling how crisp it was compared to the clothes I usually wore. I didn't argue. I didn't ask what kind of confusion she meant. I simply placed it in the closet and used it the next time people came over. From there, the boundaries became clearer and smaller at the same time. I stopped sitting at the dining table. "It's just easier this way," Ashley explained, setting a plate for me near the kitchen counter instead. My entrance shifted too. The front door stayed closed to me during gatherings. "Guests use that space," she said once, guiding me gently toward the back hallway. "This is more convenient." The basement room became mine without much discussion. It had a low ceiling, a small window near the top that let in a thin strip of light during the afternoon. The air always felt a little cooler there, a little removed from the rest of the house. I arranged my things quietly, stacking what I needed, leaving the rest untouched. Upstairs, the guest rooms remained ready, clean, unused, waiting for people who would stay for a night or two and leave. Downstairs, I settled into a space that felt less like a place to live and more like somewhere to pass time. When people visited, Ashley would introduce me the same way every time. "This is Frank. He helps us keep things running." The words were consistent, delivered with a polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. Most guests nodded, accepted it without question, and moved on. A few glanced back, as if trying to place something that didn't quite fit, but no one asked. Jason heard it all. He stood there, part of the conversation, close enough to correct it if he wanted to, but he never did. He would shift slightly, adjust his posture, sometimes look away, and then continue talking about something else. Days blended into each other. The rhythm became predictable. Wake up early, move through the kitchen, keep things in order, stay out of the way. It wasn't forced in the way people expect. No one raised their voice. No one made demands that sounded unreasonable on their own. But put together, piece by piece, it built something I hadn't fully recognized until much later. Because at some point, without a clear decision, without a single conversation, I stopped being a father in that house and started becoming something else entirely. And the question I hadn't asked yet was how long it had been happening without me noticing. It wasn't just the way Ashley spoke to me in front of guests. It was what she said when she thought I wasn't there. The house had a certain rhythm to it, and after a while, you learn how sound moves through walls, how voices carry from one room to another without meaning to. I started noticing it more once everything else had settled into place. The small pauses when conversations shifted, the lowered tones that didn't quite stay as quiet as intended. One afternoon, I was in the pantry, organizing shelves that didn't need organizing, when I heard her in the living room. She was on the phone, pacing slowly, her voice carrying just enough through the open doorway. "You should have seen him," she said, a short laugh slipping out. "Frank actually thought he could make a scene at dinner, like he has any place doing that." I stood still, a can in my hand, listening without moving. "He's been having these moments lately," she continued. "Confusion, saying things that don't make sense, like he forgets where he stands in the house." There was a pause, then a softer tone. "We're trying to manage it, but it's getting harder." The words didn't sound dramatic. They were measured, careful, shaped to fit whatever story she needed them to tell. I set the can down slowly, aligning it with the others on the shelf, as if the small detail mattered. It didn't stop there. Over the next few days, I caught fragments of similar conversations, different people, same pattern. Concern, explanation, a quiet suggestion that something wasn't quite right with me. Not enough to accuse, just enough to plant an idea. But the part that stayed with me, the part that didn't leave, came a week later. Lily and Noah had come over for the weekend. They used to run through the front door the moment they arrived, their voices filling the house before they even took off their shoes. Lily would head straight for the kitchen, asking what I was cooking. Noah would linger nearby, pretending not to care but always watching. That's how it had always been. That day was different. I was standing in the hallway when they came in. Lily stepped inside first, her hand still holding onto her mother's sleeve for a second longer than usual. She looked at me, then quickly looked away. Noah followed behind her, quieter than I'd ever seen him, his shoulders slightly drawn in. "Hi," I said, keeping my voice light, the same way I always had. Lily nodded, barely. "Hi." Her voice was soft, careful. Noah gave a small wave, but didn't step closer. They moved past me without stopping. No hug, no questions, no lingering the way they used to. I watched them walk into the living room, their steps quick, like they were moving through a space they didn't fully trust anymore. Later that afternoon, I heard Lily's voice again, this time from the guest room upstairs. The door wasn't fully closed. "Mom," she said quietly, "do we have to stay here all weekend?" A pause, then, softer still. "The man who works here, he makes me feel weird. The man who works here." I didn't move. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, my hand resting lightly on the railing, listening to the silence that followed. "She said sometimes he forgets things," Lily added after a moment. "Like he thinks he's part of the family when he's not." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They settled into place exactly where they were meant to land. I stepped back slowly, careful not to make a sound, letting the house return to its quiet rhythm, and standing there, in a place that had once felt like it belonged to me, I started to understand that this wasn't just about being pushed aside anymore. It was about being replaced, and I hadn't yet figured out how far that replacement was meant to go. The full picture didn't come together all at once. It arrived in pieces, as everything else had. But this time, the pieces didn't leave much room for interpretation. It was a Tuesday morning. The house was quiet in that midday way, when most of the light comes through the windows at an angle, and the rooms feel larger than they are. I was upstairs, dusting along the hallway, moving slowly, so I wouldn't track anything across the polished floor. Jason and Ashley's bedroom door was slightly open, just enough for voices to slip through without effort. "I've been looking into places," Ashley was saying. Her tone wasn't casual this time. It was focused, almost methodical. "There's one about an hour out, Sunset Manor. It's clean, well managed. far enough that it won't be a constant issue. I paused without meaning to. The cloth in my hand stayed pressed against the edge of the table as I listened. "I don't know, Ash," Jason replied. His voice sounded uncertain, quieter than hers. "Dad doesn't need that kind of place. He's fine." "Is he?" she asked, and there was a slight shift in her voice, softer but more deliberate. "Jason, think about it. The confusion, the way he talks sometimes, like he still believes things that aren't true. You've seen it." I stood there, just outside the doorway, the sunlight catching the dust in the air between the hallway and the room. "He's just adjusting," Jason said after a moment. "Mom's been gone a while, but that doesn't mean we ignore what's happening," Ashley cut in, not raising her voice, just tightening it. "Dr. Collins agrees. I spoke to him yesterday. He said early intervention makes all the difference in cases like this." Dr. Collins. The name settled in my mind with a weight I hadn't expected. "What did you tell him?" Jason asked. "The truth," she said. "That Frank has been having episodes, that he gets agitated, that he doesn't always understand where he is or what his role is here." There was a brief pause, then a softer addition. "I told him we were concerned for his safety and ours." I felt my hand tighten slightly against the wood beneath it. The hallway seemed quieter than before, the kind of quiet that presses in from all sides. "And what does that mean?" Jason asked. "It means," Ashley said carefully, "that we can start the paperwork. Dr. Collins said that with the right documentation, we could have him placed within a few weeks. Maybe sooner, if we go through the emergency route." "Emergency?" Jason repeated. "Just in case things escalate," she replied. "We don't want to wait until it becomes a problem we can't control." The words were calm, organized, already decided. I could hear the faint rustle of papers, the soft click of something being set down on a surface inside the room. "It's not permanent," she added. "It's just what's best for everyone. And once he's settled there, we can finally move forward. No tension, no unpredictability, just us. Just us." I stepped back slowly, careful not to let the floor creak under my weight. The cloth slipped from my hand, landing softly against the baseboard, but neither of them seemed to notice. Standing there in the hallway, with the light shifting slightly as a cloud passed over the sun, I realized something with a clarity I hadn't felt in a long time. This wasn't about misunderstandings, or small adjustments, or even quiet disrespect. This was a plan. A structured, deliberate plan, built piece by piece, conversation by conversation, and I had just heard enough to understand where it was leading, but not yet how far they were willing to go to make it happen. I didn't confront them that day. I didn't knock on the door, ask questions, or demand an explanation. Instead, I went back downstairs, finished what I had started, and moved through the rest of the afternoon the same way I always had, quietly, predictably, as if nothing had changed. But something had, not outside, inside. The part of me that had been waiting for things to correct themselves, that part finally stepped aside. The next morning, I left the house earlier than usual. The air was still cool, the street empty except for a few cars parked along the curb. I drove without turning on the radio, letting the sound of the engine fill the space instead. Robert Hayes' office was in the same place it had always been, a narrow brick building tucked between two newer structures that tried too hard to look modern. The brass plaque by the door hadn't changed. Neither had the smell inside, paper, coffee, something older that settled into the walls over time. Robert looked up when I stepped in. He didn't seem surprised to see me, just studied me for a second, longer than usual, before gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. "Frank," he said, folding his hands lightly. "It's been a while." I sat down, placing a thin folder on the desk between us. "I need to get everything in order," I said, keeping my voice level. "Not later. Now." He didn't ask what I meant right away. Instead, he opened the folder, scanning the first few pages. The deed, the account summaries, the payment records I had been keeping without really thinking about why. As he read, his expression shifted, not dramatically, just enough that I could tell he was connecting the details faster than I was saying them. "Do they know?" he asked after a moment. No, I said. And they won't. Not until it matters. He nodded once, reaching for a notepad and writing something down. All right. Then we structure this carefully. His pen moved in short, precise strokes. First, we make sure ownership is absolutely clear. No ambiguity, no assumptions. Everything is tied directly to you. I leaned back slightly, watching him work. The room was quiet except for the soft scratch of the pen against paper. Second, he continued, we organize the financial records. Every payment, every transfer, every expense covered on their behalf. Not just for documentation, for clarity. He tapped the edge of the folder lightly. If this turns into a dispute, you don't explain, you show. I nodded, feeling the weight of the papers in front of him in a way I hadn't before. They weren't just records anymore, they were structure. And third, Robert said, looking up at me now, we move at your pace, not theirs. Whatever you decide to do, we make sure it happens cleanly. Cleanly, the word stayed with me for a second. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a few more documents, placing them beside the others. Bank statements, confirmations, small details that had once felt routine. Now they felt different, defined. Robert adjusted the stack, aligning the edges with a careful motion. You've been keeping track of more than you realized, he said. Maybe, I replied. Or maybe I just didn't want to see it until now. He gave a small nod, then closed the folder and set it neatly in front of him. Either way, you're ready. I stood after a moment, the chair sliding back softly against the floor. The light coming through the window had shifted, brighter now, catching on the edge of the desk and reflecting faintly off the polished surface. As I reached for the door, I paused briefly, my hand resting on the handle. For the first time in a long while, nothing felt uncertain. Not the house, not the people in it, not even the outcome. The only question left was how they would react when the version of reality they'd built stopped holding together. I didn't announce anything. I didn't make a speech or give them a warning. The change happened quietly, the same way everything else had been built. One call, then another. Automatic payments stopped. Transfers paused. Accounts that had always been full simply weren't anymore. There was no drama to it, just an absence that would eventually have to be noticed. It took less than 2 days. I was in the kitchen that morning, standing at the counter, slicing vegetables with the same steady rhythm I had used for years. The knife moved cleanly, the sound soft against the board. The front door opened, and I heard the familiar shuffle of mail being picked up, then silence, then a sharp intake of breath. Jason, Ashley's voice cut through the hallway, tighter than usual. Can you come here? Footsteps followed quickly. Papers rustled. I didn't turn around. What is this? She asked, her tone shifting between confusion and something sharper. We've got notices, multiple ones. Mortgage, credit cards, the cars. Jason's voice came lower, slower. That doesn't make sense. Everything's on autopay. That's what I thought, she replied, flipping through the envelopes again. They're saying payments didn't go through, that there are insufficient funds. Insufficient funds. The words settled into the space between them, heavier than they sounded. I rinsed the knife under the faucet, watching the water run clear, then set it aside. There has to be a mistake, Jason said after a moment. Maybe the bank flagged something. Then call them, Ashley snapped, already pulling out her phone. This doesn't just happen. They moved into the living room, voices lowering, then rising again as the minutes passed. I stayed where I was, finishing what I had started, letting their conversation unfold without interruption. By the end of the day, the tone had changed, not confusion anymore, pressure. I heard it in the way Ashley spoke on the phone, faster now, repeating details, asking for explanations that weren't coming. Jason moved through the house differently too, quieter, distracted, his attention pulled somewhere else. The next morning, he found me in the kitchen. Dad, he said, lingering near the doorway. His voice carried hesitation, something measured. Can I talk to you for a minute? I nodded, setting the cup I had just filled on the counter. We're having a bit of a situation, he continued, stepping closer but not quite meeting my eyes. Some kind of issue with our accounts. It's probably temporary, but Things are a little tight right now. I waited. He shifted his weight slightly. I hate to ask this, but could you help us out? Just for a short time, maybe a few thousand, until everything gets sorted. A few thousand. I looked at him, taking in the way he stood there. Not aggressive, not demanding, but certain in a quiet way that I would say yes, that I always would. I don't have that kind of money available, I said, keeping my tone calm, almost neutral. He blinked, surprised. Are you sure? Maybe from savings or… I'm on a fixed income, I replied. You know that. He nodded slowly, though the uncertainty didn't leave his expression. Right, yeah. I just thought it was worth asking. He turned and walked back toward the living room, his steps slower this time. A few minutes later, Ashley's voice rose again, sharper than before. He said no? He doesn't have it, Jason answered. That's not possible, she said immediately. He's been living here for years. He must have something. There was a pause. Then her voice dropped, colder now. If he's not going to contribute, then we need to rethink everything. I stood there, listening to the quiet that followed. Not surprised, not even disappointed, just certain. Because sometimes you don't need someone to say exactly what they think of you. You just need to take away what they depend on and watch what they do next. I didn't wait for another conversation behind closed doors or another phone call I wasn't supposed to hear. That evening, I asked them to sit down in the living room. No raised voice, no urgency, just a simple request that sounded ordinary enough. Ashley hesitated for a second, watching me like she was trying to decide what version of me she was about to deal with. Jason followed her in, quieter than usual, his shoulders already tense. I took my seat first, the armchair by the window, the one that had always been there. The light outside had softened into that late afternoon glow, stretching shadows across the floor in long, quiet lines. I placed a folder on the table between us, keeping my hands still on either side of it. There's something we need to clear up, I said. Jason nodded slightly. If this is about the money… It's not about the money, I replied, cutting in gently. It's about where it comes from. Ashley's posture stiffened. What does that mean? I opened the folder and slid the first document forward, the deed. This is the house, I said. As you can see, it's in my name. Jason leaned forward, frowning as he read. You told us it was ours. I told you it was for you, I said. That's not the same thing. Silence settled in, not heavy, just clear. I placed another set of papers beside it. Bank statements, payment confirmations, records that had once been routine. Everything you've been using, the cars, the credit cards, the bills, it's all been coming from me. Ashley let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but it didn't carry any humor. That's not possible. Jason didn't say anything. He was adding it up, quietly, piece by piece. And there's one more thing, I continued, keeping my voice steady. I heard the conversation about Sunset Manor. Ashley's expression changed, not dramatically, just enough. You were planning to have me placed there, I said, based on information that isn't true. Jason looked up sharply. Dad, we weren't… You were, I said, not raising my voice. And that matters. The room stayed still for a moment. Then I closed the folder and rested my hand on it. So here's how things are going to work from now on, I said. If you want to stay here, you'll do it properly. Rent, expenses, everything is handled by you. No more assumptions. Ashley shook her head slowly. This is insane. It's simple, I replied. You either agree or you find somewhere else. Jason looked between us, his face drawn, uncertain. Ashley stood first, her chair sliding back sharply against the floor. I'm not staying here under those conditions, she said. She didn't wait for an answer. She walked out, already reaching for her phone, her steps quick, controlled, final. Jason stayed. He sat there a moment longer, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the table. I didn't see it, he said quietly. Not the way it was. I didn't respond right away. After a while, he nodded once. like he had reached a decision he wasn't fully ready to explain. The house felt different that night, not quieter, just clearer, like something that had been held in place for too long had finally shifted. And sitting there, watching the last of the light fade from the window, I realized the only thing left to find out was whether that shift would actually change anything, or just reveal what had been there all along. Later that night, the house settled into a different kind of quiet. Not the heavy silence I had grown used to, but something steadier. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a single lamp on, the light pooling softly across the surface, catching the edge of the cup in front of me. No voices carrying from other rooms, no footsteps moving above me, just the faint sound of the clock on the wall, marking time the way it always had. I thought about everything that had led to that moment, not just what had been said, but what had been allowed. The small compromises, the things I chose not to correct, the silence I mistook for patience. It's easy to believe that giving more will fix things, that if you just hold things together long enough, people will remember what matters. But that isn't always how it works. Sometimes, what you allow quietly becomes what others expect, and eventually, what they believe they deserve. Money can build a life that looks complete from the outside, a house, a table full of food, a room full of people who seem comfortable. But it doesn't create respect. It doesn't define who you are in someone else's eyes. That comes from something simpler and harder to maintain. Boundaries that aren't crossed just because it's convenient. I used to think staying quiet meant keeping the peace, that it was the better choice, the stronger one. But silence, when it lasts too long, can turn into permission. And sometimes, the only way to restore balance is to stop explaining and start showing. If you've ever felt overlooked in your own home, or found yourself giving more than you receive, you probably know how easy it is to let that pattern continue. The question isn't when it started, it's when you decide it has to stop. If this story resonates with you, take a moment, leave a comment, share your thoughts, or just let me know where you're listening from. I read more of them than you might expect. Because in the end, respect isn't something you ask for, it's something you make clear. And I can't help but wonder, if you were in that room that day, would you have stayed quiet, or would you have said something sooner?